Key terms in African Caribbean literature: Harlem Renaissance, Negritude Movement, Creolization.
Welcome all. Today, I would like to discuss with you certain movements in history that will serve as a background to the study of African and Caribbean literature. It includes Harlem Renaissance, Negritude Movement, and Creolization. So let's discuss in detail.
Before getting into Harlem Renaissance, I shall give a note on the Great Migration. The racial segregation and discrimination, as well as the poor economic conditions in the southern states, caused the movement of 6 million African Americans out of the rural southern United States to the urban northeast, midwest, and west of US between 1916 and 1970. This is known in American history as the Great Migration or the Great Northward Migration or the Black Migration. Harlem Renaissance. As a result of the Great Migration, new African American cultural expressions sprout across the urban areas in the Northeast and Midwest United States, of which Harlem was the largest. The Harlem Renaissance was an intellectual, social, and artistic explosion centered in Harlem, Manhattan, New York City, spanning the 1920s. At the time, it was known as the New Negro Movement, named after The New Negro, a 1925 anthology edited by Alain Locke. The social foundations of this movement included the great migration of African Americans, dramatically rising levels of literacy, the creation of national organizations dedicated to pressing African American civil rights, uplifting the race, and opening socio-economic opportunities, and developing race pride, including Pan-African sensibilities and programs. Harlem Renaissance was a blossoming of African American culture, particularly in the creative arts, and became the most influential movement in African American literary history. Embracing literary, musical, theatrical, and visual arts, participants sought to reconceptualize the Negro apart from the white stereotypes that had influenced black people's relationship to their heritage and to each other. The movement laid the groundwork for all later African American literature and had an enormous impact on subsequent black literature and consciousness worldwide. While the Renaissance was not confined to the Harlem district of New York City, Harlem attracted a remarkable concentration of intellect and talent and served as a symbolic capital of this cultural awakening. In 1917, Hubert Harrison, the father of Harlem radicalism, founded the Liberty League and The Voice, the first organization and the first newspaper, respectively, of the new Negro movement. Crucial to the movement were magazines such as The Crisis, published by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, Opportunity, published by the National Urban League, and The Messenger, a socialist journal eventually connected with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, a black labor union. The zenith of this flowering of Negro literature, as James Weldon Johnson preferred to call the Harlem Renaissance, took place between 1924 and 1929. 1924 was the year when Opportunity, a journal of Negro life, hosted a party for black writers where many white publishers were in attendance, and 1929, the year of the stock market crash and the beginning of the Great Depression. The Renaissance led to the publication of black authors by major American publishers and increased the presence of black actors in American theaters. There occurred a greater control by black artists over representations of black culture and experience. The emergence of African American writers such as Richard Wright, who called for greater social and political engagement, and Countee Cullen, Jesse Redmond Fawcett, Langston Hughes, Zora Hurston, Elaine Locke, Claude McKay, James Van Der Zee, Dorothy West, Aaron Douglas, and Rudolph Fisher gave a strong impetus during the Renaissance period. The Harlem Renaissance was unusual among literary and artistic movements for its close relationship to civil rights and reform organizations. It is considered to have been a rebirth of the African American arts. Now, the Negritude Movement. Negritude is a literary movement that originated between the 1930s and 50s as a protest against French colonial rule and the policy of assimilation among the French speaking African and Caribbean writers who lived in Paris. Assimilation is a term used to describe the French colonial policy in Africa. The policy was aimed at turning Africans into Frenchmen through the process of education. The leading figure of the Negritude movement was Leopold Sédar Senghor. Aimé Césaire, Leopold Senghor's and Leon Damas's dissatisfaction, disgust, and personal conflict over the state of the Afro-French experience in France motivated the Negritude movement. The movement was influenced by the Harlem Renaissance, and Senghor was attracted by the poetry of Mackay and Hughes that were published in Review of the Black World in 1931. Senghor called Mackay the true inventor of the values of negritude. The word negritude was coined by Aimé Césaire in his 1939 poem Notebook of a Return to My Native Land. He saw negritude as the fact of being black, acceptance of this fact, and appreciation of the history and culture and of black people. Césaire emphasized that the acceptance of the fact of blackness was the means by which the decolonization of the mind could be achieved. Now, two particular Francophone anthologies were pivotal to the movement, which would serve as manifestos for the movement. One was published by Damas in 1946, titled Poetess d'Expression Franquise 1900 to 1945, and the other was published by Senghor, titled Anthologie de la Nouvelle Poésie Nègre et Malgache de langue franquise in 1948. Damas's introduction to the anthology was meant to be a sort of manifesto for the movement, but it was the preface written by the French philosopher and public intellectual Jean-Paul Sartre for the anthology of Senghor that propelled negritude into the broader intellectual conversation. Jean-Paul Sartre analyzed the negritude philosophy in his essay Orphée Noire or Black Orpheus that served as the preface. Sartre characterized negritude as the opposite of colonial racism. In his opinion, negritude was an anti-racist racism, a strategy with the fine goal of racial unity. The assertion of black pride by members of the Negritude movement was attended by a cry against assimilation. Assimilation we have discussed before. They felt that although it was theoretically based on a belief in universal equality, it still assumed the superiority of European culture and civilization over that of Africa, or assumed that Africa had no history or culture. They were also disturbed by the world wars in which they saw their countrymen not only dying for a cause that was not theirs, but being treated as inferiors in the battlefield. They became increasingly aware that their study of history of the suffering and humiliation of black people, first under the bondage of slavery and then under colonial rule. The basic ideas of Negritude movement were from the following views: that the mystic warmth of African life, gaining strength from its closeness to nature and its constant contact with ancestors, should be continually placed in proper perspective against the soullessness and materialism of Western culture. That Africans must look into their own cultural heritage to determine the values and traditions that are most useful in the modern world. That committed writers should use African subject matter and poetic traditions and should excite a desire for political freedom. That negritude itself encompasses the whole of African cultural, economic, social, and political values. Above all, the value and dignity of African traditions and people must be asserted. Senghor treated these themes in his poetry and inspired a number of other writers like Birago Diop, David Diop, Jacques Rebe Menangera, Cameroonians Mongo Betty and Ferdinand Toyona, and the Congolese poet Chikaya Utamsi. The movement largely faded in the early 1960s when its political and cultural objectives had been achieved in most African countries. Now to Creolization. Originally a Caribbean concept, Creolization describes the mixing together of different people and cultures to become one. The term comes from the word Creole, used to describe people born in the New World as opposed to those who were African born slaves. Creole people are thus ethnic groups which originated during the colonial era from racial mixing, mainly between West Africans as well as some other people born in the colonies, such as Europeans and sometimes South Asian and Native American people. In short, it refers to locally born persons of non-native origins, either of European or African ancestry or both. They will be culturally distinct from the old world of their origin. The idea of Creolization gained prominence during the Second World War when scholars such as M.A.Z. Sher wrote about the ambiguities of Caribbean life and the cultural identity of black Africans in a colonial setting. In this respect, Creolization can be related to negritude. Today, the term Creolization is sometimes used to describe the cultural complexity of the world we live in and of the many diverse societies that exist within it. From the language perspective, Creolization is the process through which Creole languages and cultures emerge. Creolization was first used by linguists to explain how contact languages become Creole languages, but now scholars in other social sciences use the term to describe new cultural expressions brought about by contact between societies and relocated people. About 100 Creole languages have arisen since 1500, which are predominantly based on European languages such as English and French due to the European Age of Discovery and the Atlantic slave trade that arose at that time. With the improvements in shipbuilding and navigation, traders had to learn to communicate with people around the world, and the quickest way to do this was to develop a pidgin or simplified language suited to the purpose. In turn, full Creole languages developed from these pidgins. A Creole language or simply Creole is a stable natural language that develops from the simplifying and mixing of different languages into a new one within a fairly brief period of time. While the concept is similar to that of a mixed or hybrid language, Creoles are often characterized by a consistent system of grammar, possess large stable vocabularies, and are acquired by children as their native language. So these three features distinguish a Creole language from a pidgin. Creolistics or Creology is the study of Creole languages and as such is a subfield of linguistics. Someone who engages in this study is called a Creolist. So these are some of the references that I have used for my work.
Hope you all understood the concepts. Thank you so much. Stay safe. Have a great day.